Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I am your host, David Agranoff, and I'm excited to interview, I think, for the fourth time, Brian Evenson. Well, he was a guest on Dickheads when we did A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is not technically an interview. We were talking about the book, but
Right.
But Brian is somebody who, before I was even doing a podcast, I had him on to talk about his book, his novel Feral, when I was like kind of testing the waters of my ability to interview people. So he goes back to this podcast before it was actually a podcast. And Brian, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So we're going to talk today about your short story collection, the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which is, quite a cheery title.
Right.
And so we're going to get into some dark and themes with it. But before we do that, for anyone who might not be familiar with Brian's work, Brian, let's give people a little introduction. Before I let you kind of go on that, I just want to say Brian is absolutely one of my favorite writers. He's, in my estimation, he is one of the best short story writers going today in the dark fiction field, whether you're talking weird, bizarro, horror, sometimes science fiction. Brian touches on all of that. And he also writes novels, and his novel Immobility is a favorite of mine. So we'll get into that stuff. But Brian is also a teacher. So Brian, why don't you tell us about where you come from, and just give us a brief introduction of you as a writer.
Okay. Yeah, I teach right now at Cal Arts in the critical studies program here. I've taught at various other places, was at Brown University for a while, was chairing the program there in creative writing. And in terms of my own writing, I mean, I'm someone who, I feel like I've kind of been doing similar things across my career, but at the beginning people called me innovative fiction, and now they see me as doing some kind of genre crossover. And I think it's just that people have become a little more accepting of what genre fiction is or can do. So I'm someone who straddles genre and literary fiction, someone who has a lot of interest in different genres. Yeah.
Right. And as a writer, my introduction to you was actually in the physical world, because the first time I ever heard of your work was you did a signing at Powell's when I lived in Portland for Last Days. And you were sharing the stage with Jamia Jefferson, I believe. And
That's
I
right.
had gone. Yeah, and I had gone to see her at the reading, and just as an excuse to go to Powell's, and I remember my first kind of introduction to you was that I saw you scoping out Thomas Ligotti books in the horror section before the reading.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well, this guy's got good taste. I'm interested. And but after the reading, I remember I went down to look at your extra books, and they said, oh, well, he's not in horror, he's in literature.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I don't know about you guys, but the guy I saw reading upstairs was reading some pretty horrific stuff with Last Days, which is a novel about a guy who infiltrates a mutilation cult, by the way. Right. And so that line between what is literature and what is considered dark fiction or horror fiction, I respect the fact that you're able to kind of have a foot in both worlds, but I think what you're basically saying is that was never really intentional. You just wrote the stuff you wanted to write, correct?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I've always had an interest in kind of dark areas and dark stuff, and it kind of just naturally developed. And Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of horror writers who I identify with, a lot of literary writers I identify with, and I just feel like those genre lines are a little bit artificial sometimes.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, is in speaking of Legati, is just that like, and I
Right.
don't know, it was just maybe it was a coincidence, but I did like walk past you and Powell's, and I did notice you had a bunch of Legati books, and Legati is one of those authors that um kind of is respected in both circles, but
Yeah.
has had less um has gotten out of the genre ghetto a little bit less, but I think part of that is that also you being a part of the academic world
Yeah.
and writing in that is probably is helped to keep you out of that ghetto that some writers get
Oh,
stuck in.
totally. I mean, I think that's been something that, because I think it's like I go and do readings at universities, and then when I get introduced there, they're like, yeah, he's creepy, but he's literary, and it's their way of like selling me to their colleagues. And so yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been very lucky to be
And we
able to.
say he's literary but creepy.
Right, exactly. Right. So I feel very lucky that I've been able to kind of, because I could see how it could happen that both the horror world and the literary world might hate someone, but in this case, they've both been very embracing and very positive about my work.
Yeah, and but you've done some things like Dead Space, Dead Space video game novel, an
Yeah,
Alien tie-in,
yeah,
and so you've done some stuff, and mostly under the name B.K. Evenson. Now,
Evanson, yeah,
yeah, and so those things are out there, and you've had fun doing those things,
yeah,
and but one of the things that I thought of when I was looking at this book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been a little bit since we've had an Evenson novel, right?
yeah.
And I know that you've done really well and conquered that form really well. Last Day's Immobility is really good, but it seems like lately you've been putting some focus into short stories. Is that intentional or unintentional? Um,
I've always really thought of myself as more of a short story writer than a novelist. I mean, I'm happy with those novels, those two novels in particular that you mentioned, Last Days and Immobility, and also there's one called The Open Curtain. Those three I'm really proud of.
mhm.
But I really see, like, short stories are for me where the most exciting things are going on, and it may be partly that you can kind of jump into a world, do something with it, and then jump out, go somewhere else.
Right.
So yeah, I do think that, but I've also, I found myself thinking more and more about, the collection of stories as being more than just like, oh, I got a bunch of stories, I'm going to throw them together, and more
Mhm.
about, how are these stories talking to each other? How are they kind of shaping things in a way that makes this more than just individual stories? So yeah,
Yeah, and that's how personally I did my two short story collections where they were themed, and if there were plenty of stories that I had that just didn't fit the theme, and I just didn't,
yeah, right, exactly,
they're just homeless amorphous stories floating around.
right,
But for me, like that, having a theme to me, and that is a lesson I learned from Jeremy Robert Johnson,
yeah,
where because very early on in my writing career, Jeremy said to me like, "Hey, short story collections generally don't sell, but if you have a theme to them that people can latch on to, like, oh, I want to read a bunch of stories with that kind of theme,
yeah,
then." Now it's different for you
yeah,
because I believe you have such a great reputation for short stories that it's not hard to sell a Brian Evenson collection because there's a lot of us who are like, whatever the short stories are, I'm going to read them. I'm going to check them out. And, and that's definitely how I feel. Like if you're going to put out a short story collection, I'm there,
cool.
you know,
Well,
I'm
so I
going
know I'll sell at least one copy. That's awesome. Um,
to,
it's been funny. I probably there has a people have always talked about how novels sell better than short story collections, and I think that generally the kind of default with that is true. Coffee House, who's the press I publish with, has been incredibly good at just they love the idea of me doing short story collections, and they've always been game to do it. And so that's just given me the freedom to really kind of experiment with the form and just do it.
Right. And then they have some of these like cool, if you're on YouTube, like these cool, like basic like these the covers work together in a way.
Right.
Like the art is really neat how they do that. But
Yeah, right. My non-binary child Sarah did the covers, and they kind of design them so they kind of make a beast and kind of can be arranged in different ways. And yeah.
oh, that's really cool. Yeah. And the thing about two is that for me, each of the collections, I've read 4 of your collections. So how many do you
Okay.
have? Like,
Maybe, I don't know, maybe 7, 6. I'm not sure exactly.
okay, so I still have work to do, and I need to
Yeah.
read the Open Curtain as well. It's been when I get a new favorite author, such as yourself, a lot of times I don't want to read everything right
Right.
away. I want
Yeah.
to like kind of plan. Like a lot of times, it's like, oh, I have a flight, so I'm gonna read the next Evenson, right?
It's good to savor it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I know, yeah, because I know you're the same way too. Because we talked about how you flew through like PKD, for example, and then
Yeah.
what do? He's gone, you know. And
Right.
thankfully, we're still gonna have more work of yours, but
Mm.
but of the 4 collections that I've read Contagion, A Collapse of Horses, Song for the Unraveling of the World, and now the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, and each one kind of has standout stories, and so we'll go into depth of this new one. But for
Sure.
example, like A Collapse of Horses, it was Any Corpse was the story that really that I have a very distinct memory of. Like that was a great story. And Songs for the Unraveling of the World, it was Dust, right?
Right.
And I think what's really cool is that a really good short story collection too, a lot of times, you know, you'll have stories that will stand out, but it's the vibe that you're kind of getting from like, you know, when you kind of dip into an author being able to give you a kaleidoscope of styles and different weird and things. And that's one of the things I do appreciate too, is that you experiment a lot with the form in short stories, and
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
hard to do in a novel, because in a novel you kind of have to have a straight line, and you have to have, it has to feel like the same novel all the way through.
Right. Right. Yeah, and you talked about things being thematically connected, and that's partly what's going on in this, but it's also like just the idea that the stories are talking to one another,
Mm-hmm.
so that you have that. It's not that it's like super rigorous in terms of those thematic connections, but you still feel like something in one story kind of leads you to another story, or makes you think about another story differently, and hopefully it all kind of adds up over time.
Yeah, and please, if I get something, if I'm way off on a story, definitely tell me, because when I sent the review, when I put the review out and of this book, my first thought was, I wonder how much Brian is laughing at me for way over reading into things
Mm,
or totally missing things. And we'll get into all that, because there's a lot of details, because
yeah.
I knew I was going to be speaking to you about this, because we had talked about it before I read it. For
Right.
those are on YouTube, you can see like my copy is extremely highlighted and dog-eared, because I actually was like, okay, I have a chance to pick Brian's brain about how he did this, which is
Hmm.
one of the absolute like joys of doing a podcast about this, is like, it's an excuse for me to talk to the people who wrote the books that I'm reading.
Right.
and
Right.
and for those, well, for those who are still alive, because I read a lot of out of date science fiction, um but yeah, so let's get into a little bit of some of those themes and some of the stories that are out there. I
Yeah.
just wanted to give an introduction to people, and tell people like why they should read this before we start getting into the themes, because you can pause this podcast and come back, because one of the missions that I've kind of had for this podcast is that I always like the chance to talk to the authors of the books I'm reading, because it gives me a chance to learn from you guys by picking your brains. But I also want to pay it forward, and for other people that have a chance to read this is a unique opportunity for those of us who, you know, can dive into a book like this, and not everyone's your CalTech students who are lucky enough to get to pick your brain quite often.
Yeah.
And I do want to say, before we get into that, one thing about that is that I know you were, I know, like, Duncan Barlow recently, who's a mutual friend of ours, author.
Yeah.
He recently taught a horror class, right?
Right.
And I think this year you taught science fiction, right? This last year?
No, I taught a horror class kind of when the pandemic was starting. I was in the middle of a horror class.
Right.
And so this would have been last year. And the
I
last
should
year
have
I
gotten
did,
you guys on together.
so I did a fairy tale class this year is what I ended up doing, which was a little more, with all the stuff with the pandemic, it was a little more bearable to do fairy tales than to do like a straight out horror class. But yeah, I was teaching a horror class when the pandemic struck, and then suddenly I was having to figure out how to do it online. And I was going to do, it was film and fiction, and I had some very odd things in terms of film. I was going to do House, that Japanese movie, if you know that, and which you can't, at the time you couldn't find on any kind of streaming format. So I had to like suddenly change everything, figure it out.
Right. So I'm wondering, and this is what I was getting to, is that a lot of these stories were published in various different magazines with different different anthologies and things with different editors. And so they all had influences in different ways, and we'll get to that. But before we get to that, I'm wondering, during the time that you wrote a lot of these stories, do you think the classes that you were teaching influenced any of the direction of, because this is a huge part of your life at the time that you're working on these things. So
yeah,
I often wonder if what the main focus of what you're teaching, whether it's fairy tales, horror, or science fiction, how they influence like the running and going themes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely has an influence, and I try, especially whatever the class is, to teach books that some books I know, but also some books I haven't read before, as a way of kind of just learning new stuff and exposing myself to new stuff. And in fact, when I did the fairy tale class, I do a multi-week unit on Little Red Riding Hood, and that kind of, there's a lot of contemporary versions of that kind of fade into horror, and in very interesting ways. And so yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned, I think at the end of the book, that Algernon Blackwood was a huge influence on this book. And certainly it was like teaching, I've taught The Willows over and over again for years. But last year, kind of when the pandemic had just started, a little before that, I decided to kind of systematically go through his work and just realize there's all these amazing stories that he's written that I hadn't read or didn't really have that much of an idea about. I knew the Wendigo, and I knew The Willows, and very little beyond that. And so that was a big, had a huge impact on me, I think. And so yeah, and every once in a while I'll come across a writer or a thinker who just really takes me in a new direction. There's a moment when Robert Aikman, suddenly I was reading a lot of him, and he really taught me to do things. And then also just sometimes just seeing how students respond to things really changes the way I think about them as well. So I do see the teaching and the writing is connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine sometimes like a student like really connecting to a work that that you're giving to them, or not connecting to it, and seeing like how your students kind of get in or out of that stuff is probably very impactful.
Yeah, and I did teach. Now I'm realizing what you're saying before. I taught a speculative fiction graduate level workshop, and so it was about, we read a lot of speculative fiction of various kinds, and then the students wrote it, and that was a big influence just in terms of making me think about that larger kind of ultra genre a little bit more.
Well, yeah, and me specifically is the guy who does Dickheads and has started to take the study of science fiction very seriously. I am very curious and what you had them learning, but we could stay focused on this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I think I did talk to you a little bit about it around that time, but and if anyone wants to, like, we get into Brian's feelings on speculative fiction a lot on the 2 interviews or the 2
Right.
episodes of Dickheads, specifically to the Canticle for Leibowitz one, which quickly became one of my favorite science fiction novels ever.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, and so people should definitely check that out. But so there's a lot of different sources for the publication of the stories here, and I know I kind of mentioned it already, but I'm wondering what because you did acknowledge in the acknowledgments, like thanking like all the different editors for how they impacted the stories, and I think that's, for me, my 2 collections, a lot of it, I only had a few stories here and there published. They were developed in the theme for the collection, so they had mostly a single editor. But I'm wondering, having that many different editors kind of influence a book that seems so thematically connected, what are some ways that different editors who worked on some of these stories like had an impact on some of the stories? Do you have any good anecdotes or stories because I think the way editors work with writers is underrated sometimes.
Yeah, I think it can be. I mean, it really varied from editor to editor and story to story. I mean, some editors are very hands off and not very aggressive. I mean, but there were others like To Breathe the Air, that story, which was published in McSweeney's. The editor I worked with there, Molly McGee, really had, she didn't have dramatic suggestions, but she had a few suggestions in terms of moving and rearranging the story a little bit. And that was actually incredibly helpful, just in terms of seeing, oh, this can slot in here, or if this piece is closer to this piece, then it'll do something in terms of the way in which people kind of perceive it. So it would be sometimes things like that. And there were some of the pieces were written for specific purposes. Grower in the Snow was written for what was it? It was a book that was dedicated to Stefan Grabinski and his work. And so I'm kind of responding to another writer there. Other things were written kind of for other purposes. But yeah, I mean, I think editors can, the thing with editors is you have to figure out, often an editor will suggest something and it just won't seem quite right. And then you have to kind of go back and think about, all right, what's the problem the editor's trying to address? And is there a way of kind of sorting through that and coming at it in another way? So sometimes the suggestions of the editors would just lead me to other things that the editor ultimately would be happy with and would make the work better for both of us.
Yeah, I've only had the experience of editing one anthology and being on the other end of that, and it can be a really for a writer and for the editor, it can be a really good mind meld sometimes.
Yeah.
Where you get to really see what the author's thinking.
Right, exactly.
And I like what you're saying about how you have to, because I've been more on the end of being the writer, and I do think sometimes, a lot of times, the first time you read a suggestion, you may be like, what?
Yeah.
And then you have to, like, I like what you're saying. You have to think like, okay, well, what are they seeing? Where can we meet in the middle?
Right.
And a lot of times stories really improve for it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing is like figuring out, how can I make this work? And it there was a lot of back and forth with To Breathe the Air, for instance, in a way that was really productive and that I really appreciated. And I think editors are often overworked enough that it's just, it's great when they're willing to kind of take the time to think really seriously about a story.
Yeah, totally. And that's one of my favorite stories in the collection. So,
oh, cool. Awesome.
You really got a vibe on that one, but we'll come back to that one. So, all right. So at this point, we're going to get into spoilers as far as like, we're going to talk about the stories, assuming that you've read them. So at this point, if you have not read The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, then pause and come back. I guarantee you it'll be worth it. And because I think we're going to get into some really fun stuff. So the first story is a story called Leg, which it doesn't, this one was interesting because it is a very surrealist story. And a surreal horror story, because this one's an example to me of not giving a shit about the rules. Like, because what I liked about Leg is that if you pitched this concept, if you said, like, this is what the story's about, for most people, for most like literalists, they're just going to be like, what? The prosthetic leg is a monster, right? And so I'm really wondering, like, where did this original concept come from to begin with, and then we can talk a little bit about the execution, because there's a few things in there.
Right. Where'd that come from? I don't know exactly where that came from first. It just kind of came.
Yeah.
And it was the idea, I mean, I think it was partly this idea of thinking of kind of assembled beings, or the idea of the cyborg as being something that potentially could have more than one consciousness, so that you have something that's part human and then part machine, but maybe there's the human brain and the machine brain. And so I think I kind of started with that, and then it just kind of moved in this stranger and stranger direction until I had this idea of this creature that seems to be a very good mimic, and also seems to be able to kind of change in these really strange and unexpected ways.
And develops kind of a symbiotic relationship with this captain.
Right.
Yeah, and then so here's one thing too. It's funny because it's like a sleight of hand trick, because I was so like kind of mesmerized by what the leg was and what it was doing.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was intentional, but in a lot of the stories, and one of the things about your writing style is that you're not super detailed about place or location. Some writers have to, like, Stephen King's an example of where everything is described to a very serious level. And what I realized when I finished the story was I wasn't even sure if she was captain of a sea vessel or a spaceship. Or I had no idea. And then because I was so focused on what the fuck is this leg thing? And was that intentional, or was that just the effect that it had on me?
Well, you were talking earlier about just the influence of classes, and I think that, for me, that story feels very influenced by fairy tales. And so there's something about the way in which it's told and stuff that puts you in this space where it just feels kind of like outside of time or something. And so, yeah, it was somewhat intentional because of that. I see it as in space. So it's kind of like what happens. It's like a tale or a fairy tale being told about something that happened in space, but maybe not being told in space. And so it's this kind of weird combination of a very traditional way of telling and a very far future. And those two things coming together in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that happens with my work a lot. It's like I'm very specific about what I'm making you pay attention to in a way that sometimes allows other details to remain kind of vague.
Yeah, and it works. There's a point in the book where, and I'm not even sure which story it is, where a character says, "Is this a place?" And then somebody else says, "Well, it is or it isn't." It's like, and to me, it was funny because when I read that line, I like highlighted it, and I was like, I don't know where this fits into my review or my discussion of this book, but it's just a thing that, and then even when we get into like the story that that takes place in the train, it's like, what kind of train is it? It doesn't matter, because the vibe and the mood is the thing. And I do like that part of your work where, because I don't know if I could do that as a writer. I'm kind of somewhere in between. Like I like to have like a firm ground of the places that I'm at. Right.
Sure.
But I like it as a reader, that I like that it's kind. I like the sleight of hand of that. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you have to figure out what you need to pin down and what you can kind of leave open. And so a lot of that for me is a lot of my revision process when I'm working on these stories is figuring out what I can take away. And so usually when I'm revising, the stories get more compressed. They get a little bit tighter. And part of that is just figuring out how can I have the strongest effect possible with, with fewer words, and just figuring out how to do that. So that there's a story called The Turnip Princess, which is a fairy tale. And it's this really strange little fairy tale that was just rediscovered just like a decade or something ago in a German archive. And the thing that's great about it is it's like it has just all this weirdness to it. And it's very specific about explaining some things and leaves all sorts of other things blank. And I think fairy tales in general do this, where you can very quickly see what's important to the writer by what they explain and what they just don't think needs to be explained. And so, and I think that's probably, in terms of just the way in which I kind of operate, that's probably a big influence.
Yeah. Well, I specifically, in the way that I write, is I try to not waste as any time as possible. I try to do everything really like, but what's funny is as a reader and with your work is that, I can luxuriate in some of your prose, when you're doing things. But what's really interesting to me is that I feel I can see that whole thing where you're talking about how you pare down, because one of the reasons why I think you're one of my favorite authors that toes the line between literary and genre is because I have always felt that you don't waste time or you don't dilly dally. Like a lot of literature, so-called literature writers do waste a lot of energy, like,
for sure.
Loving their verbose language. And as much as I actually, really do love your prose, I love the fact that you don't waste time on things,
Yeah, no, I mean, I want to have a certain velocity to the work, but I'm really careful about the prose. So you can enjoy it for the language, but also I want things to be moving. So I'm not in love with navel gazing.
Yeah. So, well, and you're this is really funny to say, because I don't know how this is going to come off, but you're a master of vagary. And I really appreciate that. And it comes in with whether it's like the places where you never know what city you're in, you never know what state, it doesn't matter for a Brian Evenson story, but also it often doesn't matter what the characters are named. When you have, characters named nameless citizen, nameless person, or archivist, or, like a lot of stories just get descriptions. And I know in the past you've had a habit of repeating the same name just out of like, you don't even want to think about names, right? Like a lot of times. I don't remember what the name was, but I remember the very first time I saw you speak talking about Last Days, it was a character name that you had used many times.
Yeah, the name Klein I've used 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 different projects, maybe more. And there's variations of it I've used as well. Yeah.
So on the not naming characters, like, do you think that there's a risk there, or
I mean there can be a risk, and of course there are characters that are named in the collection. When I do name them, I tend to opt for strange names in some ways, or unusual names, partly because it characterizes them kind of from the beginning. But yeah, I mean, I think if you don't give a name to a character, then you're identifying them by other means. Either you're leaving it very blank as a pronoun, or you're doing things like you mentioned already, you call someone by their profession, or the archivist, or things like that, and that ends up forefronting the importance of whatever it is they're doing, or whatever it is they're being called. But yeah, I mean, the risk is whether readers can identify with them or feel like there's enough there to hold on to. if they're not given a name.
Right. So to breathe there, this was one of my favorite stories in the collection. And one of the
Cool.
things that I really liked about it was there's a really, really organic and strange line between the location and the main character, because the people that inhabit this city and I got this feeling that what you were trying to go for. Now, I could be wrong about this, but the feeling I got when I read the story is that the line between the destroyed environment of this future and the existence of the people trying to survive on it has become almost broken down to the point where like the very survival of both the people and the place are so intertwined. Am I reading too much into this, or?
No, but I don't want to give too much away. I mean, I think one of the things about that story that I really like is that there's a lot of room for interpretation in that, which, so
Right.
you talked about it as vagary, but I think of it as productive ambiguity. And so I think that that's one way into the story. And yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at there's something about the relationships of the human of the main characters to the environment where it doesn't seem like they quite belong anymore.
Right,
And
and this comes out in a passage on page 71 of, or at least I know it's an uncorrected proof, the one that I have.
It'll probably be the same. Yeah.
It'll probably be the same. Yeah. And then it says, and then he would tell me a story about a city that had come from another world, a city that was in ways he could either not explain or which I could not understand sentient. So this is where it got really strange, where I was thinking like, is this, I started to wonder if we were getting into almost like surrealist dark city or matrix territory where we were in a private cosmos and those kinds of things. So but that was a moment, that moment really hit me hard when I was reading it, because it just like, it's one of those where you read a line that kind of just reorients your whole brain. you know And so congratulations, you reoriented my brain there.
I'm glad I could. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are these moments of where the characters are the disorientation moments, where one character is trying to tell another character something and they don't quite understand it or don't make sense of it. And whatever the thing is being told is something that we kind of as readers have to figure out or derive. So, and I think this story in particular, it's about, the situation that you're kind of figuring out as it goes along. And there's something mysterious about, the characters that are called citizens as opposed to the other characters, and how they are different or not different, which ultimately, I mean, I don't think it makes sense for me to say, this is what's going on here, because I feel like it's more being able to occupy this space of possibility in several different ways is what makes the story work.
Yeah, and this is the one that I in my brain saw like, oh, this could have been a great novel, or this could have been a great screenplay, or like a really weird movie. And this is the one that I saw expanding. So, and then the whole idea of the nameless citizen, like, and the nameless person who objects to the idea of being called a citizen, and which is one of those which was a very funny moment in the book, where he says, I'm going to stop you right there. I might be nameless, but I'm not a citizen. I'm not of your community.
Right.
And that just like opened up the story in a huge ways, because I had to stop reading and think about what this meant. Although I was still laughing about, I'm going to stop you right there.
Right. So yeah, I mean, and that's interesting because so before we talk about that, I should say, with To Breathe the Air, it was actually Claire Boyle who was the editor for that story.
And
I'm
The Nameless
realizing
Citizen was a different story.
right,
But,
Nameless Citizen is a different story, but To Breathe the Air, I'm realizing that Molly McGee edited a different story thing for me for McSweeney, so I apologize for that mistake. But yeah, so Nameless Citizen, that story, I think what happens is when you start to read that, you start to think of it in relationship to stuff going on with To Breathe the Air, because the notion of citizen's been so common with that story. And then Nameless Citizen, I think, also is meant to feed into Immobility a little bit as well, and another novella I wrote called The Warren. So then that's part of what I it's not that there's a theme that runs through all the stories, but it's like the idea of a citizen and belonging ends up kind of going from one story to the other, and the way in which that kind of bounces off themes of like, how do we fit in the world, or how do we belong in the world, or what's our relationship to this world we're destroying. All those things kind of start talking to each other after a while.
Excellent. Well, and that's one of the I love the idea, because definitely I saw the connection to Immobility. I saw that it kind of seems like it could be in the same world, and it seems like what you're doing here with a lot of these stories, the theme, if there's anything that I can see as a unifying theme with a lot of the stories, and not all of them, because like Devil's Hand and Leg kind of seem like surrealist horror stories kind of on their own. But most of the stories have this theme of this like kind of post-functioning, like environmental apocalypse. And so that's obviously a theme that's like on your mind a lot lately, which I think should be on everyone's mind lately, especially people who have children or grandchildren, thinking about the future. So that happened organically, I'm assuming. You didn't mean to. It's just a theme that
no. It's pretty organic. I think it's just something that's on my mind, and hard for it not to be on on your mind. And something I think about more and more. In fact, a lot of the stories I've written since the stories in this book also kind of move in that direction. There's a story at tor.com called Solution that kind of moves in a similar direction and picks up on things going on with some of the other stories.
Well, I like to think I'm in good company then, because my first short story collection, Screams from a Dying World, was all environmentally themed. Not nearly as good as the work here, but I think that I think ecological horror, obviously it's a thing that you and I have talked about before, because I'm a massive John Brunner fan. And John Brunner didn't just write about ecological themes once or twice. He had his 4 main masterpieces were in the field of environmental horror. And if anyone doesn't know what we're talking about, John Brunner's The Sheep Look Up, Stand on Zanzibar, The Jagged Orbit, and Shockwave Rider.
I think I told you, I don't know that we've talked about it, but maybe we talked about it on Facebook, that I just read Stand on Zanzibar and The Sheep Look Up, reread this year, and it was really enlightening to just think about that in terms of what's going on now.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think Stand on Zanzibar is the best, in my opinion, it's the best science fiction novel of the 20th century. That's just my personal
It's very
opinion.
good.
It is. It's incredible. And we did an episode on, and in fact, one of my favorite sci-fi podcasts just put out a Stand on Zanzibar episode today. Who Goes There?
Cool.
But I definitely am interested at some point offline to talk about your thoughts on Stand on Zanzibar. I definitely think, but I definitely see like a lot of the similar themes that are in that book here too, because I think that whole looking at environmental themes, it's almost impossible if you're writing speculative fiction these days not to get into them, because and everybody, and a lot of people, I mean, even like Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, PKD, as far back as 64, he was talking, he was thinking about these themes too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. My dad in the late 70s, my dad's a physicist, but
Mhm.
he was one of a kind of small group of physicists who got involved in this field called ecological physics, and where they try to use physics as a way of figuring out how ecology is changing and how the environment's changing. And so we spent a year in Hawaii when I was like 12 in 1978, I guess. And and uh, and he was studying these trees called ohia trees that were dying and trying to figure out why it was going on. And so I think, from a pretty young age, I had this kind of consciousness of like, we need to be paying attention, we need to be looking at things. And then I think there's this funny thing. I mean, I remember, like, I'm old enough to remember like the gas lines and stuff like that from the 70s, and the sense that we were running out of resources and things are breaking down, we're destroying the world. And then it was like Reagan came along and like everyone just like pushed that all under the rug. And so it's like something that's really occupied my mind for a long time, but I feel like for whatever reason now just more and more of my work is moving in that ecological horror direction. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, you're doing a great job with it.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think too, some of the things that I really liked were, I think it was Curator was the
Yeah.
first story where the cloud
Yeah.
idea of the moving cloud was a great execution of kind of the horror elements and creating tension. But also, one of the things, I think this was the story where we first got like kind of the nameless character with the
Yeah.
archivist. And so I really like that this story touched on the themes of like trying to um or basically like it's a very Curator is a very short
Yeah.
story, but what I think it really does is um it presents this idea that in the future, we're going to be trying to look to these things to try and see what kind of answers we can get out of looking in the past, and what are people going to think about when they look back
Hmm.
at the world as we know
Right.
it. At least I really like that theme of
Oh,
Curator.
cool. No, I'm glad. Yeah. Yeah, that story, I kind of wrote that in Extrication, which is quite late in the collection.
Uh-oh. Hold on a
Uh,
second, Brian. Your internet went out for a second. Let's
oh, okay.
you wrote
The
extrication.
Extrication and Curator, I wrote kind of at the same time and saw them as kind of being two different sides of the same coin, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see those stories as very much talking to each other. But yeah, I mean, I think that notion of legacy, which is something that Curator comes up with, is something that, I mean, especially if you have kids and they're thinking about kids and grandkids, it's hard not to think about, what is it we're leaving? What are we doing? Would it be better for every other species on the earth if there were humans, if humans were just not around? All those things are hard not to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
and you have several characters in this book, like straight up
Yeah.
say, and there's a part where a character says, "Well, don't you want the species to survive?" And the character's like, "Not really." Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't think so. And
Yeah. And of
and that
course,
was
yeah, it's obviously we're human and it's hard not to want the humans to survive, but it's hard to, we're damaging a lot. So
yeah. Well, that balance is really
yeah.
well expressed there. Um, so one more thing about themes, and then we'll kind of wrap up on the putting together the post production of the collection.
Okay.
Um, Transformation is always kind of a big theme with you, and part of it, I know you were one of the stories was for the David Cronenberg tribute anthology, and but
Yeah.
Transformation, going back to Last Days, which is a novel very much about mutilation and self mutilation and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But whether it's sometimes it's subtle things like the story The Devil's Hand, where it's a subtle kind of funny thing where the character wants to bet a thumb and he's like, I got 2 thumbs, I don't need it. And he's like, well, I can give you a 3rd thumb, right?
Right.
And you know, there's
Yeah, I'll
funny
attach
little,
it anywhere you want. Yeah.
yeah, I'll attach it anywhere you want. But and then there's little things like that, but then there's stories that are just huge with the way that the earth and people are transforming. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you were thinking about transformation when it comes specifically to the stories in this collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to think, is there a kind of theme that overarches the collection, then probably transformation would be the one. And so on the one hand, you have, I think that various stories are thinking about, what does it mean to belong in different ways? And so you have, what does it mean to belong to a society, and do I want to belong to it? All the citizen related stuff. What does it mean to belong to a world, and what are my responsibilities towards the world? And then also, I think just in terms of bodies, it's like there's these transforming and changing bodies, and what does it mean to be me? What does it mean to belong to this kind of meat sack, or whatever you want to call it? And how is it changing? How is it transforming? When do I stop being me? And so that notion of transformation and how one deals with it or approaches it or survives it, I think is something that runs through. And yeah, the story you mentioned, A Bad Patch, was written for a Cronenberg anthology, and was written after. That was super fun to write, just because I went back and watched as much Cronenberg as I could, and I'd forgotten a lot about his work. And and it's so much of his work is about invasion and transformation and the body being taken over in some ways, and it just was really a pleasure to kind of go back into that stuff and think it through again in different ways.
All right, so on the post-production, so you mentioned that a lot of the stories are in conversation with each other,
Right.
but they're not directly next to each other, and
Right.
obviously it's kind of up to us to figure out which ones are in conversation with each other. And
Right.
so Curator and the extraction,
The
those
extrication, yeah.
extrication, sorry,
That's okay.
those are clearly together. To Breathe the Air, Nameless Citizen,
Yeah.
very obviously, and I don't know, in a weird way, a Jostle, I think, goes in with with those ones too,
Oh
right?
yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
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 And Jostle, I thought was really good as well. I mean,
Oh, good.
if you're interested, the ones I highlighted as my favorites are Leg, Curator, To Breathe the Air, Jostle, Nameless Citizen, Daylight Come, Elo Havel, and The Extrication were the ones that were like where I actually flipped forward and took my highlighter and said, "Yep, that one was great. That one
Oh,
was
cool.
really great."
Cool. Yeah. We haven't talked much about Evil Havel, but that's one of my favorites too, and it definitely fits into that environmental theme of some of the stories you've been discussing.
Yeah. So, and why? Tell me what about that story would made it one of your favorites? Because I can tell you why it was one of mine afterwards too. But I want to hear you first.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think for me, it was that I could kind of create. I felt like the kind of creature that's in there is something that was just really different than anything I'd done before, and so I think it was partly that, and then it's partly just this. You have a kind of narrator for that story that's understands the way the world is changing, and also in some senses, because he understands it, has been pushed to a position where he's just no longer noticed or recognized or even seems to exist in some ways.
I like the placement of I like the idea that that going to the forest to die, that kind of that the importance of the role of the forest in this, when a lot of the other stories, the world, like is kind of dead. I kind of got this picture in my mind of like, you're going to go die with the forest. You're going to go, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
be a part of it. Anyways,
No, that's
that's
cool. Yeah.
kind of what hit me with that story.
Yeah.
But that was definitely one of my favorites. So these themes, these stories are talking to each other in certain ways,
Yeah.
and but you didn't. So what did you? How did you come to the order? Because I can tell you, for my two short story collections, I was very insistent about the order, which is
Yeah.
funny for a person who doesn't always read short story collections front to back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I went through it. So what I always do when I'm putting a collection together is I just start putting stories on the ground in little stacks, and then thinking about where they stand in relation to each other,
mhm,
and then eventually, I'll take some out. There's stories in here that were written before the stories in the previous book, and there's stories that were written kind of at the pretty late in the process as well.
mhm,
And it just depended. So I knew kind of very early on that Leg would begin it, and the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell would end it. There are two others that are kind of paired, in some ways, and in other ways not. And then it was just a process of, I knew I wanted to breathe the air somewhere in the middle, partly because I felt like it was doing something different than I'd done before,
mhm.
and I wanted to surround it in a way that would allow people to come into it in different ways. So it made sense to me to kind of place it there. Um, and then just gradually, I started just putting things in and deciding where I'd go, and eventually felt like I had the order that would work.
Yeah, so when I was a young reader, I would read the titles that interested me the most. And it was
Yeah,
putting together Amazing Punk Stories, my second collection, where I put a lot of energy into the rhythm of which story comes after which, that I
yeah,
changed. I was like, from now on,
mm,
I'm going to take seriously like where the authors decided to put these
yeah,
stories, because
yeah,
um
yeah.
I thought so much.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think if you read this collection in order, it'll. I think you'll whether you read it in order or not, you'll still find some satisfaction in it. But if you read it in order, hopefully the stories are kind of adding up in a different way.
Yeah, now if I was going to reread them, I might read them in a different order, because now that I
Sure.
know knowing that certain stories are kind of meant to kind of go together, it makes me want to read them back to back,
Yeah.
to a
Yeah.
degree. Um, to Breathe the Air is a story that I feel like I will be reading again to kind of really
Yeah.
digest it, the same way that I read Any Corpse from Collapse of Horses multiple times,
Yeah.
and
Cool.
Dust from your last collection. When a short story really gets in under my skin like that,
No, and
it,
that's great. I mean, I love that. Yeah, if there's stories that people like, I just love that they go back to them.
and for the record, I'm working on a top 10 horror short stories panel in the next couple months,
Mm.
and Any Corpse is in my top 10.
Oh, cool. I'm
So
glad.
it
I'm glad.
will. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm hoping to have. I know for a fact I want Laird Barron on that episode. I want to
Yeah.
hear his top 10 for
Oh,
sure.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But anyways, I know that Any Corpse is going to be on there.
Yeah. Laird would definitely be in my top 10, some of his work. So, yeah.
Yeah.
You were talking about stories and reading them in order or not. And Robert Shearman published a book last year called We All Hear Stories in the Dark, which
Mhm.
is a 3-volume book of stories that you can either read in order, or he gives you like different possibilities for going through it. He'll say, if you want to read this kind of story, go to this one. And so there's you can jump through it in different ways. And I just love that as a kind of innovative way of handling the story collection.
Oh, that is really cool. Um, all right, so Brian, you've been really awesome to give us the time to talk about this book. Is there anything that you feel like I've missed, that's something that in the writing of this particular collection, um, that you know something you've done with one of the stories in here that you've never done before that you're really excited about, your ability to experiment with these particular stories?
No, I mean, I think you've touched on what I see as kind of the larger themes, and I think a lot of the, the details are things that you kind of have to read on the page to kind of sort out. I mean, I'm definitely moving in a direction of thinking about what it means to be human or not human, which I think is something that surfaces in some of these stories, and that the stories that I've written since seem more and more in that direction. But that'd be the only thing I'd say.
Awesome. Yeah. And the title, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, why did you land on that as the title with all the different stories?
It's I don't know, from very early
Great
on,
title.
I like the title, yeah. And it's not necessarily that the title story represents the book as a whole. I think there's connections, obviously, to lots of different things in the book, but I feel like just it was such a good title, I couldn't pass it up. I ran across that line. It's taken from Marguerite Young, a novel she wrote, massive novel, like 1,700 pages, called Miss Macintosh, My Darling. And it's just, almost, it doesn't mean anything in the novel, but she said that, and I was like, oh, I need that. So stole it from that.
That's great. Yeah, it's an amazing title because it's in in this day and age, a title is everything. Like somebody's scrolling on the computer looking for
Yeah.
books, and like, oh, what's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
But
My son, who's 8, is very upset with me about that title because he doesn't think I should use the word hell.
well, he
Yeah.
hasn't read the book yet, so
No, right, exactly. Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, coming off the heels of songs for the unraveling of the world, which you know, you're going, you're going to really have to think deep for the next to go darker with the next one.
I know. I don't know what the next one will be called yet. So yeah.
Well, maybe it'll have to just be Puppies and Unicorns next
That's
time.
right. Yeah.
Okay, Brian, it was great to talk to you again.
Likewise, David.
Yeah, this was a really excellent collection. Any novels down the way, or are we going to get?
Yeah. I'm working on. I'm about 120 pages into a sequel to Last Days called Phantom Limb.
Oh,
And,
wow!
yeah. So
That's awesome.
We'll see. It's been slow going because of the pandemic and some other things I've been doing, but I hope to get there.
I was a huge fan of Last Days. That is a awesome tease. So.
Yeah, good, awesome.
All right. Anything you want to direct people to, or just buy the book?
No, I mean, I buy the book. I hope if you buy it, you enjoy it. And in any case, yeah, thanks so much.
All right. Thanks for joining us. And Brian, I'm sure I'll be thinking of ways to get you back on Dickheads again too, because you've been a favorite guest.
I'm always happy to come back. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk again soon. Bye.